ship was dying. There was no other way to say it. The enduring patience. A Belkarath heavy cruiser that had sailed the stars for 62 years was bleeding fire into the dark. 17 fractures ran along its hull like cracks in old bone. 2 of its 4 engines were dead. The third was making a sound that no engine should ever make. Life support was running on backup power. The backup power was failing too. Commander Sail Voss stood in the middle of her command deck and looked at the damage reports on the screen. She did not cry. Karath commanders did not cry. But her hands were very still at her sides, and that stillness said everything. 2 days ago, she had commanded a fleet of 31 ships. Now she had one. And that one was barely holding together. The Battle of Karen Gate had lasted less than 3 hours. The Dominion of Veth had come with weapons that the Concorde had never seen before. Weapons that punched through shielding like it was paper. Weapons that turned ships into clouds of hot metal and silence. The Concorde fleet had tried to fight back. They had tried very hard. It had not mattered. Ship after ship had gone dark, and when it was over, the enduring patience had been the only vessel left moving. Even then, moving was a generous word for what it was doing. Sail Voss had ordered her crew to push the remaining engines as hard as they could. Get away. Just get away. They had made it out of the Karen system by luck and by nothing else. Now they drifted in deep space, near the outer edge of a small, quiet star system, a yellow star unremarkable. The Velkarath charts listed it simply as Sol 3, a system with 1 inhabited planet on its third. The species living there had only been spacefaring for about 200 years. Young, very young, barely old enough to count, by galactic standards. Sail Voss had never given much thought to Earth or its people. Humans, they were called. The Concorde had catalogued them as a Category 3 civilization. Curious, energetic, mostly harmless. They had small ships, primitive weapons, and a habit of sending radio signals in all directions, as if they wanted every dangerous thing in the galaxy to know where they lived. Every older species in the Concorde found them either amusing or slightly worrying. She looked at the navigation screen. Sol 3, Earth, was the only inhabited world within range of what was left of her engines. She stood there for a long moment. Behind her, crew worked quietly. 214 people. Engineers, soldiers, pilots, medics, all of them tired. All of them waiting to see what she would do. Asking for help was not something Velkarath did easily. Their civilization was 4,000 years old. They had built wonders. They had mapped stars that younger species had not even discovered yet. They were proud, not arrogantly, but deeply, the way a person is proud of something they have spent their whole life building. To send a distress call felt like failure. It felt like admission of weakness. But 214 people were breathing the recycled air on this ship, and that air was getting thinner. Sail Voss made her decision. She did not send a distress call. She sent a docking request. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to her. A distress call said, "We are helpless." A docking request said, "We require temporary use of your facilities." She worded it formally, carefully, with the full weight of Velkarath diplomatic language. She stated their situation plainly: damage sustained, repairs required. But she did not beg, and she did not dramatize. Then she sat down in her command chair and waited. She expected to wait a long time. Earth was a young civilization. They might not have the technology to respond quickly. They might not even understand the signal. She prepared herself for silence. She told her crew to conserve power and rest where they could. She closed her eyes. 6 hours later, 3 ships appeared on the scanner. She sat up straight. 6 hours. The signal had barely had time to reach them at that distance. And yet there they were. 3 vessels, moving fast, headed directly toward the enduring patience. She stared at the readings. The ships were not elegant. They were not sleek. The scanner showed mismatched hull plates, external pipe systems, what looked like extra engine components bolted onto the outside like an afterthought. They looked to Velkarath eyes like someone had assembled them in a hurry from whatever parts were available, but they were fast, faster than they should have been, given their size and apparent design. Her communications officer looked up. "They are hailing us, Commander." Through. The voice that came over the speaker was human. Warm, quick, slightly out of breath. A woman's voice. "This is Chief Engineer Mara Okonkwo aboard the HSV Ironside. We received your docking request. We're coming to you. Don't shut down anything else. We'll take a look when we get there. How many crew do you have aboard? Sail Voss blinked. The question was practical. Immediate, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of rank or species. Just how many people, what is the situation, we are coming. 214, she said. Good. We've got medical teams. See you in about 40 minutes, Commander. The channel clicked off. Sail Voss sat quietly for a moment. 40 minutes. The human ships arrived in 38. They docked without permission, or rather, aced permission, and then started docking before the answer came back, which Sail Voss noted was either very confident or very rude. She hadn't decided which. A team of humans came aboard in thick suits, carrying cases of equipment and handheld scanning devices that beeped constantly. They moved fast and talked fast and looked at everything, every crack, every burned-out panel, every dead system. Chief Engineer Okonkwo was a short woman with close-cropped hair and very sharp eyes. She walked through the ship at a pace that made Sail Voss's officers scramble to keep up. She stopped at the engine room, at the third engine, the one making the terrible sound, and was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Okay, we can fix this. And while we're at it, can we improve a few things?" Sail Voss stared at her. "You want to improve our ship?" "Well, yeah." Okonkwo gestured at the cracked hull plating above them. "I mean, while we have it open anyway. No point in patching a hole if the material around the hole is weaker than what you're patching it with, right?" Sail Voss had been prepared for sympathy. She had been prepared for awe. Younger species often looked at Velkareth ships with wide eyes. She had been prepared for polite, careful, respectful assistance from people who understood they were dealing with a much older and more advanced civilization. She had not been prepared for this, for someone looking at a 62-year-old Velkareth cruiser and suggesting, in the same breath as offering to repair it, that it could be better. "You will repair the damage," Sail Voss said slowly. "That is what is required." Okonkwo looked at her, not with offense, with something more like patience. The kind of patience that was actually just contained energy, waiting for permission. "Sure," she said. "Whatever you want. We'll just fix what's broken." She turned back to her scanner and kept walking. Sail Voss watched her go. Something felt strange, not wrong exactly, but unfamiliar. Like standing on a surface that looked solid, and then realizing it might be deeper than you thought. The human medics moved through the ship quietly, attending to the wounded crew with skill and gentleness. Sail Voss watched them work. They adapted quickly to Velkareth biology, asking the ship's medical officer questions and adjusting their methods without complaint. One young medic, barely more than a child, by Velkareth standards, sat beside a badly injured engineer named Kale Tor and held his hand for 2 hours while the treatment ran its course. Not because it was required, just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Kale Tor later told Sail Voss it was the strangest thing that had ever happened to him. That night, or what passed for night on a drifting ship with failing power, Sail Voss sat alone on the command deck. The human ships were docked alongside, their lights warm and steady in the dark. She could hear, faintly through the hull, the sound of voices and machinery. The humans were already working. She pulled up everything the Concorde had on Earth. The files were thin. Humans had only been catalogued for 200 years. They had developed quickly, very quickly, faster than most species of their age, but they were still young, still learning, still, by every measure the Concorde used, small. And yet they had come in 6 hours. They had come with 3 ships and medical teams, and a chief engineer who wanted to improve a Velkareth cruiser, like it was a perfectly normal thing to want. Sail Voss read through the files until the screens began to blur. Then she set them aside and looked out through the cracked viewport at the stars. She had come here because she had no other choice. She had come here because 214 people needed to breathe and eat and live to see another day. She had come here expecting to receive basic repairs from a well-meaning but limited young species, thank them formally, and leave. That was still the plan. But sitting there in the quiet dark, with the sound of humans working in the belly of her ship, she had the very faint and very unsettling feeling that something was already changing, and that she didn't yet understand what it was. She told herself it was exhaustion. She was probably wrong. The dockyard was not what Sail Voss had expected. She had expected something simple: clean lines, organized stations, the quiet efficiency of a civilization that knew its limits and worked carefully within them. Young species tended to build carefully. They had not yet learned what to be bold about, so they were cautious about everything. Lunar Orbital Dockyard Alpha was not cautious about anything. It hung above Earth's moon like a structure that had been planned, abandoned, expanded, planned, and expanded again several times over. There were sections that looked finished and polished, and sections that looked like someone had added them last week, using whatever materials were nearby. There were cranes and scaffolding and ships, in various states of being built or taken apart. There was noise, constant noise, the sound of metal being shaped and engines being tested and people talking over each other. There were hundreds of workers, and none of them seemed to move slowly. The enduring Patience was towed into the main bay, and Sail Voss stood at the viewport and watched the dockyard swallow her ship like it was completely used to receiving ancient, battered Velkarath cruisers. Director Yusuf Harlan met her at the docking platform. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and the kind of calm face that came from spending years in places where things could go very wrong, very fast. He had been a military engineer before he ran the dockyard. That much was in his file. He shook Sail Voss's hand firmly, which was a human gesture she had read about but not experienced, and looked her in the eye, without the nervous deference that most younger species officials showed when meeting Velkarath commanders. "Welcome to the dockyard," he said. "We're going to take good care of your ship. I expect a full report on the repair plan within 24 hours, Sail Voss said. "You'll have 1 in 12, Harlan said, and walked her to the briefing room. The repair plan, when it came, was 12 pages longer than she had expected, and included 17 items she had not asked for. She called Harlan back and pointed to them one by one. He explained each one patiently without getting defensive, and each explanation was logical. Not elegant, the thinking was blunt and practical rather than refined, but logical. She approved 8 of the 17. Harlan nodded, made a note, and then approved the other 9 anyway without telling her, which she only found out 3 days later. She should have been angry. She found that she was mostly curious. The humans worked in a way that Velkarath engineers did not. Velkarath engineering was structured. There was a plan, and the plan was followed. Changes to the plan were formally proposed, reviewed, debated, and approved or rejected. It was a system that had served them for 4,000 years, and produced some of the finest ships in the known galaxy. Humans did not do this. Humans had a plan, and then someone would look at the plan and say, "What if we did it this way instead?" And someone else would say, "That's crazy, but let me think about it." And an hour later, 3 people would be arguing loudly, while a 4th was already building the new version to see if it worked. And sometimes it didn't work, and they took it apart, and tried again, and sometimes it worked better than the original plan. Nobody seemed particularly bothered either way. It was chaotic. It was also, Sail Voss had to admit, very fast. Dr. Priya Anand knocked on the door of Sail Voss's temporary quarters on the 4th day. She was a small woman with quick hands and a distracted energy, like she was always thinking about 3 things at once. She was a xenomaterial scientist, someone who studied the physical composition of alien materials. She had a request. "I'd like to analyze your hull plating," she said, "the outer shell. I want to understand the alloy composition." Sail Voss raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it's better than anything we make," Anand said, with a cheerful honesty that Sail Voss was starting to recognize as a very human trait. "I want to understand why, and then I want to see if I can make something better. Something better than Velkarath alloy." "I don't know yet," Anand said. "Maybe not better in every way, but maybe better in some ways. Different threat profiles, different stresses. The Veth weapons are energy-based. Wait. Your alloy is optimized for kinetic resistance. What if there was a material that absorbed directed energy instead of deflecting it?" Sail Voss stared at her for a moment. "That is a significant materials science problem. It would take years of research." Anand smiled. "I've been working on it for about 3 weeks. I have some early results I'd like to run past you, if you have time." She did have some early results. They were rough and incomplete and full of gaps, but the direction of the thinking was right. Sailvoss recognized it immediately, because the Vel'Karath had explored a similar direction 200 years ago before concluding it was impractical. She told Anand this. Anand listened carefully, asked several sharp questions, and then said, "Okay, what if you approached it from the molecular bondings instead of the lattice structure? Would that change the conclusion?" Sailvoss didn't know. Nobody had tried it that way. Meanwhile, in the lower levels of the dockyard, something else was happening. Weapons Officer Tan Ra had been assigned a human liaison, a young Sing soldier named Corporal Dmitry Volkov, who had been given the job of making sure the Vel'Karath crew had everything they needed and didn't accidentally wander into restricted areas. Volkov was young, 24 by his own count, with a relaxed manner, and the habit of telling long stories about things that had almost gone wrong. Hadn't. He and Tan Ra had very little in common, and within 2 days they were spending most of their free hours together. Tan Ra showed Volkov how Vel'Karath weapon systems were calibrated. Volkov showed Tan Ra the human weapons currently being installed on the refitted ship. Modular rail systems that could be physically swapped out during battle, rearranging the ship's firepower profile in minutes rather than the hours a standard refit required. Tan Ra looked at them for a long time. "These are not as powerful as standard heavy emitters," he said. "No," Volkov agreed, "but you can swap them mid-fight. Heavy emitter goes down. You don't lose a weapon slot. You drop in a different type and keep shooting. Flexibility over raw power." Tan Ra was quiet. In 4,000 years of Vel'Karath military thinking, weapons were fixed systems, permanent installations, designed for maximum output. The idea of sacrificing power for flexibility had never been seriously considered because it felt like admitting weakness. You built the best weapon you could, and you committed to it. Humans had apparently decided that being able to change your mind was more important than being right the first time. He reported this to Sailvoss. She added it to the growing mental list she was keeping of things she had not expected. The repairs took 31 days. 31 days of noise and argument and humans appearing at odd hours with new ideas and questions. On the 23rd day, Dr. Anand appeared at Sailvoss's door again, this time looking like she hadn't slept in 2 days, which she probably hadn't. "I think I've got it," she said, and held up a small panel of material. Dark gray, slightly rough, unremarkable in appearance. Ferrocarath, composite. It's a combination of our synthetic polymers and your base alloy structure, bonded at the molecular level, using a process I'm fairly sure no one has tried before because it's honestly a little insane. She handed the panel to Sailvoss. It was lighter than it looked. "What does it do?" Sailvoss asked. "It's directed energy and redistributes it across the surface, instead of transferring it to the ship beneath. Against Veth energy weapons, based on the battle data you brought us, I estimate it reduces effective damage by around 60 to 70%. Sailvoss turned the panel over in her hands. It felt like ordinary metal. It felt like nothing special. She thought about the Battle of Karen Gate. She thought about 30 ships going dark in less than 3 hours. "You built this in 3 weeks, she said. 26 days, Anand corrected, yawning. Sailvoss looked at her. At this tired small woman with messy hair and quick hands, who had taken a 4,000-year-old materials science problem and found a new angle that no one had tried. Who had not been asked to do this? Who had done it because she looked at a broken ship and saw a problem that was interesting? On the 31st day, the enduring patience left the dockyard. It looked the same from the outside, mostly. Same hull shape, same general configuration. But the hull plating was new. The phase drive had been rebuilt using a method that Vel'Karath engineers had found philosophically confusing but practically undeniable. The weapons systems included 6 of the human, modular mounts that Tan Ra had spent 2 weeks arguing against and then quietly admitted were clever. The life support was running at 112% of its original capacity. Sailvoss stood at the viewport and looked at the dockyard as it grew smaller behind them. It still looked like a pile of welded ambition. It still sounded like organized chaos. The humans who had worked on her ship were already moving on to the next project, talking fast, arguing, building. She thought about Okonkwo's first words aboard the ship. "Can we improve a few things?" She had thought at the time, that it was the question of someone who didn't quite understand the situation, didn't grasp that they were dealing with Velkarath technology, centuries beyond what they could truly comprehend. She understood now that she had been wrong. Okonkwo had understood exactly what she was looking at. She had looked at a Velkarath cruiser, 62 years old and battle-broken, and seen something that wasn't finished yet. That was how humans looked at things. Not as finished or broken, as current drafts. Sail Voss wasn't sure whether that was a beautiful way to see the world or a dangerous one. Sitting in the command chair of her rebuilt ship, feeling its new systems hum around her like a living thing, she was beginning to think it might be both. The message came from Director Harlan 3 days after the enduring patients left the dockyard. He wanted a meeting, not a formal diplomatic session. Just a meeting, he said, between people who had been working together for a month and had things to discuss. Sail Voss agreed, mostly because she had been expecting something like this. Humans, she had learned, did not do things without reason. The 31 days of repairs had not just been about fixing a ship. She had understood that somewhere around day 15, though she had not yet been able to say exactly what else they had been about. She returned to the dockyard. Harlan met her in the same briefing room as before, but this time there were others. A small group of officials and advisors, sitting quietly along the walls, not crowding the table, just present, watching. Harlan put a proposal in front of her. He had written it cleanly, without excessive language which she appreciated. It said, in plain terms, that humanity wanted to enter the war against the Dominion of Veth, not as a support force under Concord Command, as independent combatants, contracted allies with their own command structure, their own ships, and their own operational decisions. In exchange, they asked for 3 things: access to Concord jump lane charts, a seat at whatever peace table came after the war was over, and the right to debrief every battle survivor from every engagement with the Veth, every soldier, every officer, every crew member who had seen combat and lived. Sail Voss read the proposal twice. Then she looked up at Harlan. "You want the debrief, right?" she said. "Yes. Not expanded territory, not resource agreements, not weapons technology access. No." She set the paper down. "Why?" Harlan folded his hands on the table. "Because we've been watching this war for 2 years, Commander. Every engagement we could get data on. Every ship that came back damaged, we studied the damage. Every tactical report the Concord shared publicly, we analyzed. We've built models of how the Veth fight, their formations, their preferred engagement ranges, their weapon charge cycles, the gaps in their coverage patterns." He paused. "But models built on incomplete data have limits. We need the human element. The things that happened in the gaps between the data points. What actually worked for half a second before it stopped working? What a pilot noticed in the last 3 seconds before their ship went dark. That information exists only in people's heads, and it dissipates when they die or when time passes." Sail Voss was quiet for a moment. "You have been studying the Veth since they started moving against the Concord, and your government was informed of this." "My government funded it," Harlan said simply. She looked at the other people in the room. They looked back at her with the calm patience of people who had already made a decision and were waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. She thought about the 6-hour response time, the modular weapons, Anand's composite material, the phase drive rebuild that shouldn't have worked and did. She thought about a species that had spent 2 years cataloging a war they were not fighting, not because they planned to enter it, but because a threat existed, and their response to threats was to learn everything about them. She told Harlan she would take the proposal to the Concord Admiralty. He thanked her without any particular enthusiasm, which meant he already knew what the Admiralty would say, and was prepared for it to take a while. She was right that it would take a while. The Admiralty's initial response was cool. Some members found the proposal presumptuous. Humanity was a Category 3 civilization, barely 2 centuries spacefaring. And here they were proposing to join a galactic war as independent actors rather than support staff. Others were simply skeptical of what a small human fleet could contribute against the Veth, who had destroyed 31 Velkarath warships in under 3 hours. While the Admiralty deliberated, things continued to happen without their approval. Dr. Anand's ferrocarath composite had gone into production. Not in small quantities, in large ones. 40 human warships were being refitted with the new armor in the docks below Earth's orbit. Voss knew this because Tanra told her, having heard it from Volko, who hadn't seemed to realize it was information that might be sensitive. Humans often didn't, she had found. Not because they were careless, but because they operated on the assumption that shared information was useful. Useful information should be shared. She went to see the human fleet herself. 40 ships, not the sleek cruisers of the Velkarath or the heavy dreadnoughts of the Veth, but something in between, built wide and low, with external weapon mounts clearly designed for swapping, and new hull plates, still slightly different in shade from the older plating around them, where the composite had been fitted. She walked along the docking bay and looked at them one by one. They were not beautiful ships. But they had the look of ships that had been thought about very carefully by people who were very good at thinking about problems. Tan Ra walked beside her. He had spent more time at the dockyard than anyone else on the crew, and it showed. He moved through the human facility with the ease of someone who had learned its rhythms. He had stopped finding the noise irritating somewhere around day 20. The modular mounts, he said, stopping in front of one of the ships. They've made another iteration. The swap time is down to 4 minutes now. From what? 11, when I first looked at them. They've refined the locking mechanism 3 times. Sail Voss looked at the mount. 4 minutes to completely change a weapon system during active combat. In Velkarath doctrine, weapons were not changed during battle. You entered a fight with what you had and what you had determined what you could do. The idea of redesigning your armament in the middle of an engagement had never been part of the thinking. But then, Velkarath doctrine had been built around fighting other species whose ships also had fixed weapon loadouts. What happened to a doctrine when the enemy suddenly couldn't predict what you were carrying? She didn't get to finish the thought because an alert came through the dockyard speakers. Calm, not urgent, but clear. A vessel had entered the outer sol system. Not human. Not Velkarath, Veth. It was a diplomatic ship, as it turned out. Small, single-engine, the kind of vessel used for low-stakes official contact. It stopped at the edge of the system and broadcast a message on Concord standard frequencies. The message was brief. It acknowledged that a Velkarath ship had been repaired at Earth. It acknowledged that Earth appeared to be equipping a fleet. And it told Earth's government, in the flat, certain language that the Veth used for everything, stand aside and allow events to proceed without human interference, or be added to the list of civilizations that the Dominion would deal with in due course. Sail Voss was in the dockyard monitoring station when the message came through. She watched the humans around her. She watched how they reacted. There was no panic, no raised voices, no wide eyes. There was a brief, heavy silence. The kind that happens when something real has arrived and people need a second to recognize it. Then Director Harlan straightened in his chair and said quietly, "Get the council on the line." The council deliberated for 11 hours. Sail Voss had expected this. 11 hours for a civilization to decide whether to go to war seemed reasonable. She sat outside the chamber and waited. When Harlan came out, his face was composed and tired. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "What was the decision?" she asked. He handed her a printed copy of the official Concord channel response that Earth had transmitted to the Veth diplomatic vessel. 3 words. She read them. "Read them again. Get off our lawn." Sail Voss sat with those words for a long time. She had read thousands of war declarations in her years of service. They were usually long documents, formal, detailed, citing precedents and laws and justifications. They used careful language because war was a serious thing, and serious things required serious words. She had never seen a war declaration in 3 words. She was not entirely sure this was a war declaration, but she was also not sure it wasn't. That night, another ship drifted into the Sol system from the direction of Karen Gate. Velkarath, severely damaged, the heavy cruiser Unbroken Shore, the only other survivor from the battle, which had been making its way towards Sol for weeks on minimum power. Sail Voss personally went out to meet it. As it was towed into the dockyard, she watched the human crews mobilize. No waiting, no deliberation, just people moving to their stations and beginning the work. She thought about how they had arrived for the enduring patience in 6 hours, how they had turned 31 days of repairs into something else entirely, how they had spent 2 years in the dark, watching a war and learning from it without anyone asking them to. A hand touched her arm. Okonkwo, standing beside her, watching the unbroken shore come in. "We'll give this one the system treatment," the chief engineer said. Sailvas nodded. Then, because it'd been sitting in her for weeks, and she finally had the right moment. "Why do you do this?" Okonkwo looked at her, confused. "Do what?" "All of it." Sailvas gestured. "At the dockyard, at the ship, at everything. The improvements, the research, the preparations. You were not in this war. The Veth were not coming for you. You could have repaired my ship and sent me away and stayed safe." Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back at the unbroken shore as it settled into the dock. "When something sinks near you," she said, "you fix it. That's just what you do, and when something is threatening the people near you, you deal with it." She paused. "Shh. We've been watching the Veth for 2 years. We know what they do to civilizations they run through. So, yeah, it was going to be our problem eventually. We just decided to make it our problem now, while we still had time to prepare." She said it simply, without drama, the way someone would explain why they had fixed a leaky pipe before it flooded the house. Sailvas looked at her, at this woman who had walked onto a dying ship and seen potential, who had spent 31 days turning that potential into something real, whose species had spent 2 years loading a weapon that nobody had asked them to build. "You have been ready for this," Sailvas said. "We've been getting ready," Okonkwo corrected. "There's a difference." She went back to work. Sailvas stood at the viewport a while longer, watching the lights of the dockyard, moving and busy in the dark. Somewhere out there, the Veth were waiting to see what these primitives would do. She almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The Concord Admiralty did not like the human battle plan. This was clear from the first 10 minutes of the briefing, when 3 senior admirals, Velkarath, Arathi, and Sen, sat in silence and read through the tactical document that Director Harlan's team had submitted. The silence got heavier as the reading went on. When Admiral Veentor of the Velkarath finally set his copy down, he looked across the table at Harlan the way a very old professor looks at a student who has turned in something technically interesting but practically insane. "This has never been done," the Admiral said. "I know," Harlan said. "Wolfpack formation at this scale requires continuous coordination between 40 ships in real time. The communication burden alone, we've tested the relay systems. It works. You've tested it in exercises, against simulated Veth formations, against your battle data, and against modeling built on every engagement the Concord has fought in the last 2 years, Harlan said. He was calm. He was always calm, which Sailvas had come to understand was not peacefulness, but a kind of controlled pressure, like a sealed container that had a lot going on inside it. "I understand it looks different from Standard Doctrine. That's because it is different. Standard Doctrine lost 31 ships at Karen Gate." The Admiral was quiet. That particular point was difficult to argue with. The plan was this. 40 human ships would operate in rotating Wolfpack cells of 5, with each nest targeting a specific section of the Veth formation. When a ship in a cell took heavy damage, it would pull back to the rear, and a fresh ship would rotate in to replace it, maintaining pressure on the Veth line without any single vessel fighting until it broke. The modular weapon systems made this work. A ship rotating to the rear could swap its damaged emitters for functional ones in minutes, then rotate back into the fight. The Veth would be facing an enemy that never seemed to get weaker, because its weak element kept disappearing, and strong ones kept appearing in their place. Combined with the micro-jump capability, the refitted phase drives that could make very short jumps inside the battle zone, human ships could appear behind Veth formations before the enemy had time to realign. The Veth fought in fixed lines. They were very good at fixed lines. They were not designed for an enemy that didn't stay where they'd been a moment ago. The Admiralty approved the plan reluctantly because Sailvas told them to. She did not explain exactly why she trusted it. She wasn't sure she could have explained it in words that would make sense to people who hadn't spent 31 days watching humans work. The fleet assembled at the edge of the Karen system 6 months after the enduring patience had first limped into Sol. 40 human warships, their hulls dark gray with ferro-karath composite plating, the refitted enduring patience and unbroken shore beside them, a support wing of 14 Concorde vessels further back, ready to hold the perimeter, and waiting at the center of the Karen system, holding the gate they had taken with such terrible ease before. The Veth. Sailvoss stood on the command deck of the enduring patience and looked at the scanner readout. More Veth ships than last time. They had reinforced after the first battle. They were confident here. Karen Gate had been their victory, and they saw no reason why it should become anyone else's. Harlan's voice came over the fleet channel. Quiet, straightforward. He didn't make speeches. All cells confirm ready. 40 confirmations came back, one after another. Begin the human ships moved, not in a line, not in the wide defensive arcs that Concorde doctrine preferred, but in 5 loose groups that scattered in different directions simultaneously, coming at the Veth formation from angles that required the enemy to divide their attention 5 ways at once. The Veth responded the way they always responded, efficiently, powerfully, their heavy emitters firing in coordinated salvos that had obliterated Concorde ships at Karen Gate before. The salvos hit, and the human ships kept coming. On the enduring patience, Tanra watched the sensor data and felt something shift in his understanding of what he was seeing. The ferro-karath composite was working. The energy from Veth strikes was spreading across the hull surface instead of punching through it. Ships that should have been crippled by a direct hit were slowing, absorbing, and then pushing forward again. Not unharmed, but moving, still there. The first rotation happened 8 minutes into the battle. A human ships in Cell 3 took concentrated fire from 2 Veth destroyers at close range, too much even for the new armor. It began to fall back. Before the Veth could redirect their fire toward a new target, fresh ship slid in from the rear, appearing on the scanner right where the damaged one had been, its weapons already firing. The Veth targeting systems recalibrated. The ship they had just been shooting at was gone. The new one was already too close. And then the microjumps started. It was disorienting even to watch on the scanner. A human ship would be engaged at one position, hold for a moment, and then simply not be there anymore, appearing instead behind a Veth heavy cruiser, inside the gap in its rear shielding, firing at angles the enemy's armor was not designed to handle. Vel-Karath pilots had trained to never jump inside a combat zone. The margins were too small, the risks too high. Human pilots had apparently decided the risk was acceptable if the alternative was fighting the hard way. The Veth had never faced this before. In 800 years of galactic conflict, no one had used these tactics, because no one had built ships that could execute them. Fixed weapons meant fixed strategies, but here was an enemy that changed its shape in the middle of the fight, that rotated, jumped, swapped, and reappeared in places it wasn't supposed to be. The Veth formation, designed for overwhelming force along a predictable front, had no answer for an enemy that refused to stay on the predictable front. 3 hours into the battle, something happened that had not been in anyone's plan. One of the Veth destroyers took heavy damage from converging fire and began to drift, still, partially powered, but unable to maneuver. Standard practice, in any species doctrine, was to disable a ship and leave it, but a boarding team had been a part of Harlan's contingency notes, a small section in the plan that the Admiralty had treated as theoretical, since boarding a live enemy vessel in the middle of combat was considered suicidal. Corporal Volkov's Marine unit apparently had not read the part about suicidal. The boarding transport was a battered, fast little ship that had no business being in a combat zone, and it latched on to the drifting Veth destroyer while the battle raged around it. 12 Marines and 6 engineers went through the hull breach. Tanra lost track of the scanner feed for a while because he was too busy managing the enduring patience's own weapons. When he checked back 40 minutes later, the Veth destroyer was firing again. At the Veth fleet, he stared at the sensor reading. He looked at it again. He calmed Volkov's channel. "Volkov, are you inside that ship?" A cheerful, slightly out-of-breath voice came back. "Yep." The drive systems were actually pretty easy to figure out, Dima said to say hi. "Dima is you." "Yeah, it's a nickname thing." "Listen, we've got maybe 20 minutes before the power cells overheat, so..." "You repaired and repurposed a Veth destroyer. Mid-battle. I mean, I wouldn't say repaired. more like temporarily redirected. "We've got to go, Commander. The Veth are going to notice any second now." The line crackled. On the scanner, the captured destroyer made 3 more firing passes into the rear of the Veth formation before its power gave out, and it went dark. Volkov's boarding team made it back to the transport with 2 minutes to spare. Tanras sat and thought about this for a moment. Then he went back to work, because the battle was still going. It lasted 9 hours in total. 9 hours of rotations and micro-jumps and swapped weapon loadouts and a level of operational chaos that somehow produced consistent, terrible pressure on the Veth formation from every direction at once. Harlan's voice was on the command channel the whole time, calm, precise, reading the battle like he was solving a problem that was just taking a little longer than expected. When the Veth finally broke, when the formation that had held Karen Gate for 6 months began to collapse and the surviving ships turned to run, there was a moment of quiet on the command deck of the Enduring Patience that felt very large. Sail Voss looked at the scanner. 80% of the Veth force destroyed or disabled. The Concorde support wing, mostly untouched, having held the perimeter as planned, was moving forward to secure the gate. Human ships were pulling back to their rotation pattern, beginning damage assessments. 1 human ship was gone, the HSV Kestrel, lost in the 6th hour to a concentrated broadside from a Veth dreadnought that had adjusted faster than expected. 47 crew. The rest of the human fleet was already arguing, on an open channel that Sailvoss could hear from the bridge, about what they could have done differently to save it. Not celebrating, not resting, arguing about what they had missed. The Veth High Command, in retreat, sent a message. It came through on a frequency they had never used for communication before, an emergency channel, the kind used when there was nothing diplomatic left to say. It was addressed to Earth, to the Concorde, to the human fleet. It was short. "What are you?" Sail Voss looked at the message for a long time. Then she looked out through the viewport at the Karen Gate, the place where she had lost 30 ships, where her fleet had been broken in an afternoon, where she had run with a single damaged cruiser and drifted through dark space. A primitive species could at least patch her hull. She thought about Okonkwo's first words, about Anand's gray panel of impossible material, about Volkov taking a boarding team into a live enemy ship because the plan had said it was theoretical, and nobody had said it was impossible. She sent a response to Harlan. It was not a military message, just 3 words, "You knew this." His response came back in 30 seconds, "We hoped. There's a difference." She thought about that. She was still thinking about it when the Concorde flag went up over Karen Gate for the first time in 6 months, and the battle that was supposed to be impossible was somehow over. The peace summit was held on a station above a neutral world called Veth Maran, a place chosen because it belonged to neither the Concorde nor the Dominion, and because both sides had agreed it was far enough from the places where people had died that the dying might feel, very slightly, less present in the room. It did not entirely work. The dying was always present, but the agreement was signed, and that was what mattered. Sail Voss attended as the senior Velkarath representative. She sat at a long table alongside Concorde delegates from 11 species and watched the Veth negotiators on the far side. They were a disciplined people, the Veth. Even in defeat, they sat straight and spoke in measured tones and gave nothing away in their faces. She had fought against them, and she could respect that. Pride was something she understood. What she could not stop watching was the human delegation. Harlan sat 3 seats to her left. Anand was 2 seats beyond him, working on something on a datapad. Even during the formal portions of the ceremony, several diplomats found rude, and which Sail Voss had long since accepted, was simply how Anand worked. Her mind didn't stop for formalities. There were 11 other human delegates, each representing different departments and roles, and they moved through the summit the same way they did everything. Fast, practical, relentlessly focused on the specific outcome they wanted. The debrief rights were written into the treaty on page 7. Easy to miss, buried between shipwrecking lane agreements and Veth reparation schedules. Nobody from the Veth side argued it much. They didn't fully understand what they were conceding. Sail Voss suspected was exactly what the humans had intended. After the signing, the summit dissolved into smaller conversations. The kind of careful, quiet diplomacy that happened in corridors and at food tables, where the things that couldn't be said in formal session got said anyway. Sail-Voss moved through these conversations for 2 hours, then stepped away to a small observation lounge at the end of the station's upper corridor. The viewport there looked out at open space. No planets, no ships, just the dark and the stars and the quiet that existed between things. She heard footsteps and turned. Harlan came in, carrying 2 cups of something warm. He held one out. She took it. Human tea. She had tried it once at the dockyard and found it pleasant in a simple way. He sat down across from her, and they were quiet for a moment looking at the stars. "You did well in there," he said. "The Velkarath knew what outcome was acceptable before we arrived," she said. "Negotiating is easier when you know what you actually need and what you are willing to give." "Most people don't know those things," Harlan said. "That's usually the problem." She held the cup and thought about the question she had been keeping for the right moment. She had been keeping it for a while. It was the kind of question that felt too large to ask in a busy place, so she had waited for a quiet one. "When you saw my ship," she said, for the first time, "broken, in the dark, drifting, what did you actually see?" Harlan turned the question over before answering. She appreciated that. He didn't reach for the first words available. He thought, "Something worth saving," he said, "and something we could learn from." Sail-Voss looked at him. "Among my people, a broken ship is a failure. Among mine, it's a record of what survived," he said. "The ship was still there. That means something made it through. Whatever that thing was, you understand it better than you did before it happened." She considered this. 4,000 years of Velkarath civilization, they had built some of the most sophisticated ships in the galaxy. They had engineered systems of remarkable precision. They had, by every technical measure, been superior to Earth in almost every way when the enduring patience had drifted into Sol's outer edge. And yet something had been missing. Not in the technology. In the way they thought about it. Velkarath engineers built things to be finished, to be complete. A ship once built was what it was. The best its designers had made it, and therefore the thing that sailed. The idea that a finished thing could be the beginning of a better thing was not how they approached their work. Completion was the goal, and you did not tinker with completion. Humans did not believe in completion. Every finished thing was the platform for the next idea. Every working system was a question about whether it could work differently. It was restless, and sometimes inefficient, and occasionally drove Sail-Voss into quiet frustration. But it had also produced Ferro-Karath composite in 26 days, modular weapons with 4-minute swap times, and a battle plan that had broken a Veth defensive line in 9 hours that had held for 6 months. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer." "Always," Harlan said. "Were you afraid? When the Veth sent their message, when your council was deciding whether to go to war, were your people afraid?" He was quiet. Then, "Yes, very much. You didn't show it." Being afraid and showing fear are different things. He looked at the stars. "We were afraid the whole time. Afraid during the repairs. Afraid during the preparation. Afraid at Karen Gate. Fear is just information. It tells you something serious is happening. What you do with it is the part that matters." Sail-Voss thought about standing on the command deck of her broken ship, looking at the damage reports, her hands very still at her sides. She had been afraid then too, but she had also been proud, and the pride had kept the fear from becoming the loudest thing in the room. Humans, it seemed, manage the same balance differently. Fear and work at the same time. Fear and jokes and arguments and building things. Fear that never stopped anything, because stopping was not considered an acceptable response. She stood and looked out the viewport one more time. Then she said, "I would like to show you something when we return." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "Something the Velkarath have been working on. People's input." She paused. "We have been reconsidering some things." He smiled, not a big smile, just the small, satisfied kind. 2 weeks after the summit, on a clear morning above Earth's moon, a new ship rolled out of Lunar Orbital Dockyard Alpha. It was unlike anything that existed in the records of either civilization. The hull shape was Velkarath, long, elegant, built for endurance, but the hull plating was Ferro-Karath composite. The weapon mounts were modular, designed around a new locking system that Tan Ra and Volkov had developed together in what they both described, separately, as an argument that lasted 2 weeks and then suddenly became a blueprint. The phase drive was the third iteration of the rebuilt system, the one that had started as philosophically offensive to Vel-Karath engineers and had become quietly the thing their own designers were studying and borrowing from. It was not a Vel-Karath ship. It was not a human ship. It was something that had not existed before a dying cruiser drifted into the wrong star system and asked carefully and without begging for help. Tanra and Volkov stood together in the observation bay and watched it launch. It moved cleanly, with the ease of something that had been thought about very carefully by people who understood both what they were building and why. Tanra watched it go for a long time. Then he said quietly, what had been sitting in him for months, the thing he had been trying to find words, since the first day he had watched human engineers argue their way to a better answer. We came to you for repairs, he said. We did not know we were coming to be remade. Volkov stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching the ship grow smaller as it moved into its first orbit. That's usually how it goes, he said. Tanra looked at him. Does it not feel strange to you? To change people without intending to. Volkov thought about this with the genuine seriousness he showed whenever a question was worth it. We didn't change you, he said. We just worked next to you. You changed yourselves. He paused. That's the only way it actually works. The ship completed its first orbit and came around again, catching the light of the sun. Clean and bright and new, carrying in its design the shape of two civilizations that had found each other at the worst possible moment and done something useful with it. Across the galaxy, the debrief teams were already at work. Anand's materials research had branched into 12 new directions, 4 of which nobody had anticipated. The Concord Admiralty was revising its battle doctrines for the 3rd time in a year. 3 other species had quietly sent observers to Lunar Dockyard Alpha, wanting to see what was happening there and what they might learn. And in a quiet room in the station above Veth-Miran, a Veth diplomat sat alone and read through the terms of the treaty one more time. He stopped at page 7, read the debrief rights clause, then read it again. He sat very still for a long moment. He was beginning to understand what they had given away. Not territory, not weapons, not power. Something that would outlast all of those things. The right to know, the right to learn. Given to a species that treated knowledge the way other species treated oxygen, as something they could not function without, as something worth going to extraordinary lengths to obtain. He closed the document. The Vel-Karath had built wonders over 4,000 years. The Veth had conquered with disciplined precision over centuries. Somewhere in the unremarkable light of a yellow star, a young species had spent 200 years doing what humans always did. Watching, learning, building and improving, and then, when the moment arrived, had turned a broken ship into a beginning. Not because anyone asked them to, not because it was their war, but because something was broken near them, and broken things, to humans, simply problems that had not been solved yet. That was the thing nobody in the galaxy had seen coming. Not the weapons, not the armor, not the tactics, or the wolf pack formations, or the engineers who boarded live enemy ships in the middle of a battle. The most dangerous thing about humanity was the most ordinary thing. They could not look at a problem and walk away from it. They never had. They never would. And somewhere in that stubbornness, quiet and constant as gravity, the war had already been won long before a single shot was fired.